Here with reaction, Fox News legal analyst Gregg Jarrett, Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz is with us. Look, if he willfully retained this information, and that is their conclusion, and we live in a country where justice is blind and we have equal justice under the law and equal application of our laws, how do you look at the way Hillary Clinton's case was handled, Joe Biden's case was handled, and Donald Trump's case was handled? Because very clearly, Comey implicated Hillary, and in this report, Robert Hur implicated Joe Biden as being guilty, willfully retaining. Isn't that the same thing, Gregg Jarrett?
Yeah, I mean, how in the world do you explain this, Sean, to the American people? Trump gets prosecuted, Biden doesn't, because he's too demented? I mean, this report should deeply alarm all Americans. And, I do think it's compelling evidence that the cabinet should at least consider invoking the 25th Amendment in capacity, because what Robert Hur was saying today in his report is Joe Biden is not competent to stand trial. So how in the world is he competent to be president? I mean, the special counsel portrays Biden as so senile, it's impossible to prove his willingness or intent. That is fundamentally wrong under the law. At issue is not Biden's current mental state, what it was years ago when he removed, kept, and shared classified documents. And the report also cites Biden's cooperation. My Lord, that's not a defense under the law. If a bank robber coughs up the dough, it doesn't erase his crimes. That's absurd. As for the photos of classified documents laying around, Hur absurdly claims that kind of recklessness actually shows that Joe didn't know they were classified and oops, made a mistake. But with Trump, the government argues the opposite. His reckless storage proves his criminality. Again, this is a disturbing double standard under the law.
Willfully retained and disclosed classified materials. But a jury, we're told, Professor, he would likely present himself as a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory here. Why do I think that defense wouldn't work for anybody else? And that certainly is not how the law should be practiced either. And do you see the double standard that I mentioned to Greg?
Absolutely see the double standard. It is not part of the criteria whether a sympathetic jury in one part of the country, like the District of Columbia, sympathetic to Biden but not sympathetic to Trump, or a sympathetic jury in Florida might look at him and say, gee, although he committed a crime, he's an older man. That's up to the judge for sentencing. Nor is it a criteria that he may have refused to cooperate. My clients don't cooperate unless you give me something. My job and my client's job is not to help the government, not to cooperate. That's not a criteria for distinguishing these two cases. There is a connection between today's case and this morning's case in the Supreme Court. Greg talked about the 25th Amendment. It's so hard to remove a president under the 25th Amendment. You need the cabinet. It's so hard. The framers made it so difficult. And yet this morning, the state of Colorado said, you want to get rid of a president? Snap your finger, the Secretary of State. All you need is a 4-3 decision of one state, and you get rid of the president. There's such an incompatibility and inconsistency. The problem with our country today is everybody sees the law through the prism of partisan politics. Everybody tries to weaponize the Constitution to support their political candidate, and the losers are the American people.
I've really been able to delve into this with you, Professor, and I know deep in your heart, you're a Democrat's Democrat. We don't agree on everything politically, although we found a lot of areas of agreement over the years, starting with standing up against radical terrorists, et cetera. Israel is a good case in point. And we're watching these videos that we have been showing on this program for a long time, and it's a serious topic. And I know in the beginning I used to joke a little bit about it. I kind of regret it because I shouldn't have. And because it's so serious, we're dealing with the president. Surely, Professor, you see what we all see. You see what Robert Hur is talking about. Does this seem like a man that is cognitively strong enough to be president? To me, the answer is obviously no.
I am very worried about it. Look, this election is not coming down to American people rushing to the polls enthusiastically to vote for their favorite president. This is a campaign for who is the least worse. Who don't you want to be president? And today's performance and today's report is going to give a lot of solace to people who say, gee, you know, we may not like Trump, but we cannot vote for Biden. We're afraid to have somebody with those memory problems having access to the nuclear trigger, trying to resolve the issue of the Middle East. Even today, he bumbled over the Middle East very badly, dealing with Putin. So today's decision and today's report is going to have a big impact on this election, on a lot of people, including people like me who are Democrats who would be inclined to vote for President Biden, but obviously have to think hard about whether we will trust in the next 5 years for the president not to have diminished capacity, and who's going to be the vice president, who would replace him. This matter today makes the vice presidential choice even greater, because if the 25th Amendment isn't applicable today, it may very well be applicable in 2 years or 3 years if Biden is elected, and we see a continuation of some of the cognitive problems that we saw in the report.
Its cognitive issues are usually almost 99% of the time, according to doctors I've interviewed, degenerative. That means it only gets worse. It never gets better. Greg, I'll give you the final question. Now that we have 3 cases we can compare and contrast, the Hillary Clinton case, which I thought was the most egregious. Now we have the case with Joe Biden, and then you have the Mar-a-Lago raid, and then a special counsel charging President Trump in the document case. And a lot of facts, a lot of things that Hur said in his report, I know not to be factual. We do know that the FBI had access to Mar-a-Lago. We do know that they were in the very room where those documents were eventually found. We do know that the FBI could have taken them. Nobody stopped them. Nobody said you couldn't come back either. They would have been able to walk through, I'm sure, if they asked. But the only thing that they did ask for was about 3 days later, they said, can you put another lock on that particular door, which was complied with. So now that we have 3 cases very similar in so many ways, does Trump have a case to get this thrown out of court, or probably not?
Oh, I think he does, because the exclusive authority for these classified documents resides with the Federal Records Act, which does give custody and control to a former president. And, you know, insofar as the obstruction charges against Trump, he also has a defense there, and that rests with the Department of Justice's own longstanding 2-decade-old opinion that a former president can keep whatever he wants. That was endorsed by a federal judge. He can resist, as Bill Clinton did. Clinton didn't get a charge with obstruction, but somehow Donald Trump did. Let me just say one other thing about tonight's appearance by Joe Biden, which was calamitous. You've asked, is it the worst in modern presidential history? No, I well remember during the height of Watergate, you know, Richard Nixon trying to face down and explain himself to a hostile press corps, and it got incredibly ugly.
Yeah,
I was reminded of that tonight. And I wrote a column 2 months ago. I said, look, as his poll numbers continue to tank, and as his mental infirmities become more conspicuous day after day, week after week, party elders in the Democratic Party are going to go to the Biden family and insist that they pull the plug on this campaign and step aside. I maintain that's a real possibility. I actually think it will happen. It can happen anytime before the Chicago convention in August.
We're going to watch very closely. It's going to get very interesting. I think the odds of him being on the ballot in November have been diminished significantly as of today. We'll see this unfold. We'll carry it all.